right, we're going to do another book review today. This is not as much of an amusing one as obviously the last one, which was Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972. But it is probably one of the more important books you can read if you want to get into a lot of the real issues with discussing race and education in the United States. And it's called Losing the Race by John McWhorter, which I believe was published in 2000. And I have it right here. Either 2000 or 2001. So it was 2000. In any case, so McWhorter is a professor of linguistics. He was at the time at Cal Berkeley, and today I believe he's at Columbia. So he is definitely not someone I would consider this fire-breathing, anti-black racial theorist. He's not some sort of race realist. In fact, he criticizes Charles Murray specifically in this book because at the time Murray was still well known for his race and IQ studies, which were the scourge of a lot of society back then, possibly earlier. I think in the 80s it was when Murray became more famous. So he does, however, have a lot of criticism for the mentality of the education system and of Black America as a consequence. He says so here's the foundations of victimology, and it has 7 articles of faith. And this was the most important part of the book. It's near the beginning, in my opinion, but the whole book, I would say, is worth a read. It's actually not that long. So the first article is most black people are poor. 2 is black people can't get paid less than white people for the same job. 3, there is an epidemic of racist arson against black churches. 4, the U.S. government funneled crack into South Central Los Angeles. 5, the number of black men in prison is due to a racist justice system. 6, the police stop and frisk more black people than whites because of racism. 7, police brutality against black people reveals the eternity of racism. So I would say that the one that he focuses on the most is number 1, which is that most black people are poor. Now, at the time, and I think statistics might have changed since then, I don't think that it's been a big picnic for black people in America since 2001, but it's not as if all of their wealth has been eliminated. I would say that there's a lot of economic inequality within the black community itself. There's a lot of people who are very well off in the black community, and there's a huge amount of people who are also pretty poor. But that's not to say that on average every black person is below the poverty line. When he wrote this book, so this was before the financial crash of 2008, I don't know the statistics since then, so I'm not going to prejudge that. He made the case that between 1/3 and 2/3, or I think it was 1/4 and 2/3 of black Americans were middle class. So that was one of the foundational arguments of his 7 foundations of victimology, the myth that black people are poor. Some of these other ones, he brought very compelling evidence. I read this back in May, so not all the details are very fresh in my mind, but he brought up the fact that in many of these issues, for example, police brutality. So police brutality, he claims, is not evidence that racism is eternal within the American society, because yes, there is a chance, and it's not as if it's uncommon. There is a chance that if you're a black person in America, you will encounter a racist police officer. But he says that that's hardly the way to judge the performance of black people within America as a whole, because it's not as if a black person, the average black person, gets stopped by the police literally all the time and berated and given this racist treatment. It's really something that can become a life-changing event, but it's not a constant event. Okay, so those people that are making this assumption that continued episodes of racism within the police is a sign of the failure of black people in America. He's saying that that's actually an anomaly. And then he goes through. So again, this was several years ago. So he brought up the Amadou Diallo case. He brought up the case of Abner Louima, and he said, and of course Rodney King, and he said, yes, those were horrible incidents of gratuitous abuse of suspects that were stopped by police. And then in response, the LAPD and the NYPD and other police departments in some of the other examples that he cited went through some very strenuous reforms, and therefore police brutality was reduced. Now, I think you guys know me. I'm not exactly this BLM supporter, and I'm not a Blue Lives Matter supporter. I think that the same rights and the same liberties and the same authorities should prevail for everyone. And I don't think the police are above the law, but I don't believe that people should be above the law simply because they're part of a protected class. So I would say that if the society had continued to evolve in the same way that John McWhorter was saying it was, we probably would not have seen the type of reaction to Ferguson and to other episodes. You know, there was a Sacramento shooting and there was Trayvon Martin. But we have to assess what is the cause of it. Yes, there are episodes of police brutality and unjustified shootings of black people. Remember, back in the 90s, it was mostly police brutality. So that was beatings. That was Rodney King was beat by 4 police officers. So now we've evolved to the point where we're actually talking about police shootings as opposed to beatings. Okay, and with shootings, in some cases, they are ones where the officer finds that the life is threatened. And in other cases, we find that it is simply a misinterpreted threat, or, for example, in the Walter Scott, I think it was Walter Scott case, it was fully unjustified. The police officer had no reason to shoot. But the debate has changed. What has not changed is that the media continues to portray police officers as essentially these squads of assassins that hunt down black people. To claim that the police are perfect is wrong, but to claim that they are these ruthless killers, these hitmen for the law, is just as much of an exaggeration. And I think that's roughly the same as what John McWhorter was talking about. As far as the crack into South Central, so I had to look into that a bit myself, and I still haven't really found much evidence of it. But most of it was based upon the Freeway Rick Ross book, or was it a book? Whatever. So the Dangerous Liaison, I think, was the series published in the San Jose Mercury News back in the 90s by Gary Webb. And unfortunately, there was never any substance to those claims as represented by Webb and by Freeway Rick Ross, meaning that, yes, the U.S. government did have a role in covering up drug trafficking by the Contras. No, there is no evidence that they used Freeway Rick Ross and some of his associates in order to funnel crack into the black community. It's a non sequitur. So those are two unconnected events, and it's been used basically to amplify this notion that all of this suffering and drug addiction within the black community was directly tied to the CIA and the government's attempts to keep black communities poor and unhealthy. He also goes through the cult of separatism, talking about mainstream culture versus white culture. So he makes this case. These are a few things, and these themes are pretty broad, so I really just summarized it. I do recommend you read the book just to get the full flavor of it, because I can't bring out the real expression of it within an outline or a presentation. But he makes the case that to a lot of people within the black community, the idea that there is a general culture, a widespread culture, the mainstream culture, is that there is a white culture, that there is a predominant culture that is based on race. Meaning, if you watch, for example, on TV, especially TV in past eras, let's take an example, The Facts of Life. Remember that series? So that really expresses the norms and beliefs of white people. It doesn't express the norms and beliefs of American minorities, especially not black people. That's the portrayal of mainstream culture in black America. But there's an inherent contradiction there. And I think that McWhorter does touch upon it, which is that a fair amount of black people share the same interests as mainstream culture, right? So you do have black people, for example, that are interested in anime, just like there's a lot of white people that are. You have a lot of black people that are interested in baseball. Not quite as many as there used to be, but that's because of this cult of separatism, meaning that black culture is essentially alien to American culture, which is why there's this continued friction. The fact of the matter is that if you go to, for example, any public park over here where I live in Ohio, you'll probably see a fair amount of black people doing the same things as white people, including, for example, fishing. I went with my sister and my folks to this park a couple months ago, and there were plenty of people there fishing, and not just black and white people. There happened to be some Indian people there too. It's just the fact that there are people who have different preferences and different tastes. So then he went into a very, very interesting topic, which I've seen plenty of evidence of in my own undergrad experience. Now, I went to engineering school, so we had to take diversity requirements. And he talked about Mother Egypt, which so he calls it Mother Egypt, but it's kind of just making fun of the entire concept that there are pseudo-histories of ancient African history that are not really based on anything in archaeology or in any other respected field of study. So this is something I actually encountered. I was in an African American religion class in sophomore year, and the professor, who himself was a pretty far left-wing Marxist and atheist too, actually went out and said that a lot of this stuff about Kemet and about this ancient Nubian stuff, it's all very fine and dandy, but it doesn't really represent anything to do with the actual origins of black Americans, because most of them came from West Africa. Most of those cultures have nothing to do with Egypt, for example, or most of these other civilizations that people get all hung up on, and therefore that they are actually desecrating the real heritage of their own families, because they're focusing on something that's not even close to being tied to them. The history of the people in Ethiopia, for example, where Rastafarians consider, for example, the Haile Selassie to be God and stuff like that. He says, look, there is some theology, and there's a Christian foundation within Ethiopia that's pretty important, and things like that. There are important things that are relevant to African religion writ large in places like Ethiopia and Egypt, but that has nothing to do with the black experience in America, because we're talking about totally different eras. We're talking about, let's say, in Egypt, the Orthodox Church, the Coptics, and in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And in America, it's a completely different dynamic, because here we have a number of other Protestant denominations that obviously developed from a much later era. And then he talks about how there's this notion that because of the separateness of black people within America, any wrongdoing by black people cannot be wrong because of the historical ills and lack of belonging that they experience. Okay, now, I grant that I'm not able to transmit exactly what he was talking about here, but in broad strokes, I think that's what he meant. Then he goes through this cult of intellectualism, which goes along with the cult of separatism. And he says that black students, on average, score lower on the SAT across economic brackets, meaning that you can't explain away the poor performance by saying, well, these people are just poor and they don't have the same resources. He says no. And he goes into pretty exhaustive detail about it, saying that, even people who were in pretty elite schools seem to have issues with the SAT and other standardized tests. Then he says claims of cultural alienation within the SAT do not refute the issue of poor test performance correlating with poor college coursework. So he takes, I believe he took the issue of questions about skiing, for example, and critics of the SAT were saying, well, most black people don't get to go skiing because they can't afford to. Well, the fact is that most poor white students can't go skiing either. Most poor students of the other demographics can't go skiing either. Hispanic, Asian, mixed race. So the fact that skiing is an elitist, habit, elitist hobby, I should say, does not in and of itself make it something that's totally unrelatable for people reading a question on an SAT test. So could you make the claim that it's culturally irrelevant to the student? Maybe, but that's not really relevant to what race they are. That's more to the economic class, and still does not explain properly the racial disparity within the SAT results. He says that modern black student adjustment to racism is inconsequential compared to the previous two generations. So what he means by this is that the issues of racism, which are brought up all the time in education in America, especially in higher education, but more and more, well, I don't know, maybe it's just as bad in K-12 education, but those problems and those challenges are much, much smaller than they were in, going back to obviously the Jim Crow era and then the Civil Rights era and then, the post-Civil Rights era. Those adjustments are much smaller because of the big changes that have happened. Most people who go to public schools have at least some students who are from minority groups within their class. Now, of course, if you go out to some place all the way in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, maybe there aren't that many, but there also aren't that many schools, and there aren't that many people. So you have to remember that you can't adjust reality for the harmonious future that you want to take form just because you don't like the way some results are coming out. He also says underfunding of inner city schools is less of an issue than in previous years, and he says poor performance of black students is not due to tracking of them into lower classes based on race, but rather prior performance, which is another complaint that people have had, that, well, automatically they put my kid into the lower class because he's of a different race, not because, but he's saying that this has nothing to do with it. You could possibly, now I believe in college, generally you're able to take AP classes without permission, or sorry, in high school you can take AP classes without permission. I could be wrong. I would bet some of them you do need permission, especially if you had horrible grades in previous classes. But the truth is that, why would it be? And I think he goes into this. I don't remember precisely. But think about it this way. Why would schools that are looking to post positive statistics on minority achievement in order to often get grants and in order to get awards and receive recognition and publicity, why would they be deliberately diverting minority students into the poorer performing classes just so they could screw them over? Okay, that defeats the goal. There's no way for them to achieve and show all these metrics, which, by the way, are tracked by the Department of Education. They're tracked by all sorts of nonprofits. The unions have an interest in promoting this idea that teachers are helping minorities achieve. So why would teachers and administrators conspire in order to put black and other minority students into lower classes just in order to screw them over while making their own statistics look awful. It doesn't make much sense, and I believe that John McWhorter goes into that. Then he goes into the affirmative action debate. He actually brings up that if you talk about blacks needing affirmative action because they are poor, you are often projecting this onto middle class and often upper class black people, meaning that you're denying any economic advancement of black people since the segregation. So, notably, this defeats the original purpose of affirmative action. The notion was not that you would, you would fill a certain amount of seats with black people just in order to make the quota look better and just for the sake of diversity. There was an economic goal there, which was to make black people more successful through affirmative action. And by continuing to do it, you're actually perpetuating the notion that black people have not had any sort of benefit from the end of the segregation era. And in many cases, you're making the case that, well, they did possibly better under segregated education systems. Okay, so that's a very interesting topic that he goes into. He also said that faculty feel the need to affirm minorities by claiming they're welcome, whether or not affirmative action works. So this is the issue. He says that in academia, there is this pressure to support affirmative action regardless of whether it actually helps the student, okay, or whether it helps the college at large, or whether it helps the community, okay. It's almost as if there is an implicit and axiomatic moral imperative to support affirmative action. And I think he makes the point well, because he goes through, I couldn't find the passage, but he goes through a couple of incidents where he goes to meetings with other minority faculty, and they're really going hard about affirmative action and stuff like that. And he's saying, yeah, I mean, now that this affirmative action is being taken away, it's going to be making us look like we really need affirmative action in order to get into the university. And they looked at him as if he was crazy, because they believed that these spots are, I guess, by divine right, they belong to black people or minorities or whatever. And that really was kind of funny, hearing him talk about, or reading his accounts of these meetings where people would look at him and they'd be like, what the hell is he talking about? He also, he brought up the reason that BAM was formed. BAM, you might know, is the group that Yvette Falarca is a part of, the one that assaulted a number of people in Berkeley several times over the past few years. I think she's recently, if I'm not mistaken, she lost a lawsuit filed by one of the people that she assaulted. So he claims that they use the same victimology points that he uses in previous chapters in order to support affirmative action, but no black people within Berkeley actually supported BAM at the time. Maybe that's changed since then. And he said that neither did faculty. Like when he would go to faculty affirmative action support meetings, there was virtually no black support. You know, most of the academics besides him were white people. So that's it. I'm not going to ruin the entire book. Itself is not that long, but you might as well read it. You would probably get into a lot of the discussions that are still living today about diversity and intersectionalism and feminism and oppression and things like that. And he goes and talks a bit about some of these other academics that hated him, like Manning Marable. And, it's very interesting. Here's a little bit of his discussion at the Independent Institute from the time that he published the book.
The strangest ways. When Losing the Race came out, one thing I dreaded was the Amazon reviews. And and they haven't been that bad, but there was one that I will always remember from a certain gentleman. I guess I shouldn't say his name to be civil, but he is an African-American scholar of sorts who lives in New York City. And he had to write 2 really nasty reviews of the book on Amazon. Not just one, but he wrote in one, and the next day there's another one, just more. And he's just furious at this book. And it was kind of clear from the review that he agreed with most of the book, but he's just furious at this book. And so I thought, well, there's somebody with only so much to do. But as it turned out, we wound up on this radio show, this New York radio show, about a week later. And he was just so angry, He's yelling, he's screaming. And you know what it turned out he was upset about? And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because it really was very indicative. This guy was annoyed that 6 years ago, he had written a book, and it was about an African-American man who went to medical school, and he became a surgeon, and he was successful. He wrote a book about that. And he was very angry that my book was selling better than his book ever had. That's literally what it was. He made that loud and clear. He thought that it said something about this country that nobody wanted to hear about this surgeon. Well, frankly, I'm glad that that man became a surgeon. I mean, that is something. I mean, that's always something. But frankly, and I didn't say this on the radio show, but it's not all that unusual in 2001 or at any point in the late 20th century for, my goodness, an African American to go to medical school and get through and to practice. I mean, shut my mouth. It really is not surprising why that didn't sell. It didn't sell because, thank the Lord, it's ordinary now. This is something that this person wouldn't have thought of. This very intelligent man literally thought that this book would be a bombshell. He can't celebrate what we've done. And it's not his fault. It's not that he's a canny operator. He's not looking for power. He's about my age, and he's been duped by the climate that one is steeped in, ironically, ever since the Civil Rights Movement, for reasons that I'll talk about. So this is why.
So that's just one, and I'll post, I guess, the link to this presentation so you can watch this entire video, or if you want, I can just post the video link. But John McWhorter, I think, represents a very complicated figure in American academia and I guess in the black community. So look, I would say the majority of people don't get to become linguists and get into Berkeley, or I don't know where. Actually, I think I don't remember where he said he went to school. It might have been Cornell or Stanford. Anyway, it's been a while. The majority of people, period, don't get to go to those colleges. So as a black person, he not only represents a person who is a little bit apart from the average black American, but apart from the general public, right? There's a large part of America that goes to college and gets kind of an average degree, goes to a crappy college often, a college like, Wayne State or whatever. No offense, guys. But the fact is that they might get their degree, they might drop out of college, they might get a degree that doesn't matter, and then they have to go through their humdrum life, and really their educational achievement is really very, very small compared to what they're able to make out of it after they get out of college. I'm trying to use my degree in engineering as best I can to, marshal the resources and succeed. Right? That has nothing to do with intellectualism or anything. I don't blame my school for any failures or successes that I get in life. But when he's talking about the black community, they often do blame the educational system. And I think the educational system is very, very flawed. And later in this talk, he goes into a lot of the reasons that they're just not succeeding, the educational system. It's not to say that John McWhorter is wrong, but the fact is that the mentality that he's talking about, I would say, it's something that's pretty common among people who are simply poorly motivated. So there's a large block within the black community that is poorly motivated, right? And the same thing could be said if you go to the middle of Arkansas. There's no opportunities in sight. You might not even have, in some parts of the state, really consistent plumbing. So this is an issue for people that are born to very modest conditions and don't have anywhere to go. Now, what he says, this is his point, is that people who are born into the middle class, and there's a very large middle class that people are forgetting about, they don't have that excuse. They do have the opportunities. Really, often what's holding them back is their families' attitudes and their own attitudes, and that's really why they're so poorly adjusted. So, and therefore, that builds up into a larger cultural attitude. And if you're talking about black people as a community, as a lot of people do, and not as individuals, they have that added challenge in order to be able to succeed despite this pressure not to succeed, right? That's really what he's talking about. But I think that the conversation has to be steered in a different direction since the publication of his book, because the fact is, and I think he would probably agree, I'm not sure, maybe I'll send him this presentation, but nowadays we're beginning to see the limits of higher education being a panacea for all of societal ills. There's a lot of people who simply are not meant to go and become archaeologists or biologists or physicians or engineers or psychiatrists. There's a limit to how many people can become professionals. So some of those people who are going through school are going to have to make do with being plumbers, with being electricians, with having working class professions that are in demand, and in some cases, working in manufacturing, and in some cases, some people just are not going to be able to do those either. So I would say that unfortunately, the vast majority of the poorer people in America, and a lot of those happen to be black, they're facing the decline of the liberal educational model because of a lot of the failures of the past couple of generations, but also because of simple economics. I don't think that there's a problem. My dad is a mechanic. He did very well for himself, I may say, financially. And he's going to retire soon, hopefully. And a lot of people could go down that road too. You don't necessarily have to have a PhD in order to succeed in America. But if you do have a PhD, I think his points about intellectual honesty, about the use of evidence, about maintaining integrity in terms of not relying on rumors and hearsay and things like that, or making up data and or not even using data, or submitting bad coursework, or lowering standards, which he goes through a lot. I think those are all valid points. So please read the book. It is available at your local or internet vendor. And also please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute and on Minds.com, as well as on Subscribestar if you want to donate. All three of those are with the screen name Chef Leopard. And you can also find me on Gab at Starscream85, and I'll talk to you later.
Inside my future eye, what I see just makes me cry.